My name is Emily, and for most of my marriage I believed I had everything figured out. James and I had been married for 12 years, raising 2 children in a quiet suburban neighborhood. To everyone else, we looked like the couple who had managed to hold it all together. Matching smiles and holiday cards, polite waves at school functions, the occasional dinner out where we laughed at the same old jokes. But inside our home, inside my heart, something had begun to fade. James worked long hours in finance, and while he provided well, he often came home exhausted, speaking more to his emails than to me. I told myself this was normal, that marriages go through seasons, and that I simply needed to be patient. But nights grew colder, conversations shorter, and slowly I began to feel invisible. It was during one of those lonely evenings that I found myself in the garage, sitting across from Daniel, an old college friend who had recently moved back into town. He wasn't supposed to be there for anything more than a quick visit. He had come by to drop off a book he thought I'd enjoy. But the garage door closed behind us, and suddenly the air grew heavy with words neither of us had prepared to say. "You look tired," he said, his voice gentle. "I feel like I haven't really slept in years," I replied, half laughing, half confessing. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about being seen, about someone noticing the weight I carried. And for a moment, I let myself linger in that fragile comfort. What I didn't know was that James had come home earlier than usual. His car was parked silently at the curb, and he had walked around the house toward the garage, curious about the muffled voices he heard through the walls. I remember the exact words that sealed my fate. Daniel asked, "Does he even realize what he's losing?" And without thinking, without even meaning for it to sound so harsh, I whispered, "No, he doesn't." That was when I heard it, the firm knock against the garage door. 3 steady raps that made my heart drop into my stomach. James stood there, his face unreadable when I opened the door. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply looked past me, nodded once at Daniel, and then said, "Emily, we need to talk." The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Daniel quickly excused himself, muttering something about leaving, and disappeared into the night. I was left standing in the cold garage, my hands trembling, my mind racing with explanations that sounded weak even to me. When I walked inside, James was already seated at the kitchen table. His phone turned face down, his hands folded together. He looked like a man preparing for battle, but his voice was calm, almost detached. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "There's nothing going on," I said too quickly. "It was just a conversation." His eyes searched mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like he was truly seeing me. But it wasn't the kind of attention I had longed for. It was the piercing gaze of a man who knew the ground beneath him had shifted. "I heard enough," he replied. "I heard you say I don't realize what I'm losing. Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't." The weight of those words pressed down on me harder than any accusation could. Because in that moment I realized it wasn't about Daniel, not really. It was about the cracks in our marriage that I had chosen to fill with silence instead of truth. James stood up, pushed his chair back neatly, and walked toward the bedroom without another word. The sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor echoed like a countdown, each step pulling him further away from me. I sat there alone at the table, staring at the glass of water he had left untouched. My mind screamed for me to run after him, to explain, to beg. But my body stayed frozen, as if admitting that everything I feared had already begun to unravel. The knock on the garage door had changed everything. Not because it exposed a secret affair, it hadn't gone that far, but because it forced both of us to confront the truth we had been avoiding. Our marriage was no longer the safe, steady home we pretended it to be. That night, sleep never came. I lay awake listening to the sound of James moving restlessly in the guest room down the hall. He hadn't chosen our bed, and that choice alone told me more than any speech ever could. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was planning his exit, wondering if my children would wake up to a broken family before morning. The next day the house felt different. James moved quietly, speaking only when necessary. He poured cereal for the kids, drove them to school, and didn't once look in my direction. The silence between us wasn't filled with rage. It was worse. It was heavy, hollow, final. By mid-afternoon I couldn't take it anymore. I found him in the backyard, trimming the hedges like nothing had changed. My voice trembled when I spoke. "James, please, we need to talk." He paused, set the shears down, and faced me with an expression I couldn't read. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. "Talk, Emily. I'm listening." I told him everything. How I felt invisible, how I had buried my loneliness under routines and polite smiles, how Daniel showing up was never about attraction but about me needing someone to hear me. I spoke fast, desperate, like if I stopped I might never get another chance. When I finished, James was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "You had 12 years to tell me these things. 12 years where I would have listened if you had just tried. But instead, I hear it in my own garage, from your lips to another man." His words cut clean and I had no defense. He wasn't wrong. I had let silence replace honesty until it was too late. That evening he came to me with a decision. "I don't know what this marriage is anymore. But I know I can't live in a house where I'm the last to know what my wife is feeling. I'm moving into an apartment for now. I'll still be here for the kids, but you and we need space." The sound of the front door closing behind him felt like the final note of a song I had ignored for too long. Days turned into weeks. He came by for the children, polite but distant. We didn't argue. We didn't discuss the garage. We existed like business partners, exchanging schedules and updates. It was as though we had taken the heart out of our marriage and left only the skeleton behind. But absence has a way of forcing clarity. Alone in the quiet house, I began to see things I had been blind to before. James hadn't been perfect. His long hours, his tired silence, but he had been faithful, steady, present in his own way. He hadn't walked away when life grew heavy. I had drifted first, seeking comfort elsewhere instead of demanding it at home. I wrote him letters I never sent, each one a confession, an apology, a desperate hope that he might return. But the weeks stretched on, and the gap between us grew wider. Then one evening, he came to pick up the kids and lingered in the doorway. For the first time since that night, he really looked at me. "Emily," he said slowly, "I don't hate you. I'm just tired of being the man you settle for instead of the man you want." I swallowed hard because there was no easy reply. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was giving me a truth I had to live with. The garage had been nothing more than a conversation, but in many ways, it was everything. It was the mirror that showed us what we had both ignored. He had heard me admit he was losing me, and I had heard him admit he no longer wanted to fight for someone who didn't fight for him. In the months that followed, we signed papers, divided furniture, explained to our children why Mom and Dad wouldn't live together anymore. I smiled through the pain for their sake. But at night I faced the emptiness I had created. Looking back, the knock on the garage door wasn't just James catching me in a vulnerable moment. It was the sound of truth arriving, whether I was ready for it or not. It changed everything, not because it ended in screaming or scandal, but because it ended in silence that we could never fill again. And that's the part no one tells you about betrayal. Not the kind written in affairs or scandals, but the quieter kind. The kind that starts with neglect and ends with indifference. Sometimes marriages don't explode. Sometimes they wither, until one knock is enough to make them collapse.